I think that, the question about, how does that inform how I look at investing? I spent a lot of time reading a lot of the books of the Stoic philosophers, and they focus a lot on making sure you focus on what you have control over and what you don't have control over. I think entrepreneurs or investors focus on all the things that are going wrong in our lives instead of focusing on where we have control.
Hi, listeners. Welcome to It's the People, our interview series where we explore the inside story of building companies and investment portfolios with high-octane founders, limited partners, and fund managers. We hope these conversations push you to be even better at what you do. My name is Wills Hapworth, and I'm a general partner at Tribeca Ventures. This week, we got to interview Somak Chattopadhyay, who is a general partner at Armory Square Ventures, a venture capital firm investing in ambitious and promising startups across all of New York State and in secondary markets across the Midwest. Somak has been operating and investing in early-stage startups since 1999. Before launching ASV in 2014, he was a partner at Tribeca Venture Partners, formerly Greenhill, and was also at Edison Ventures. Somak has also held senior marketing and business development roles at Medtower, a pharmaceutical IT company, and DealTime, a comparison shopping company that went public on NASDAQ and was later acquired by eBay for $620 million. He is currently a board member of the Upstate Capital Association of New York. During our interview, we discussed a wide range of topics, including focusing on where you have control and not just on all the problems and things that aren't going well, the fact that there is little to no room in the world for mediocrity, the benefits that come from having your ego fully eviscerated, the parallels between nonverbal cues in creating music and creating a business, and much, much more. To start things off, Somak begins the conversation with his life story in 60 seconds. We have a traditional opening question that we ask, and we often ask entrepreneurs to give us the 60-second pitch on their business. So, Somak, what I'd ask of you is, can you tell us your life story in 60 seconds?
Wow. Sure thing. I hope I can do it in 60 seconds. So I've been an entrepreneur and venture capitalist now for about 25 years. I've spent 18 of those years in practicing venture capital. So I started my career in the late 90s. I did a short stint in finance, investment banking, but moved quickly to the startup side, initially running product management business development at a company called shopping.com, a comparison shopping site that went public was acquired by eBay, moved over to a digital health startup called Medtower that was a knowledge expert network similar to GLG. That was sold before I went to business school. And then I joined Edison Partners in 2005. Edison focuses primarily on B2B software companies in underventured regions. That helped form the thesis for some of the investments I pursued later in my career, especially at ASV. Moved over to Tribeca Venture Partners, which was then called Greenhill Venture Partners in 2007, where I led B2B software investments primarily in New York City, although we had investments in Colorado and Austin, Texas. And then I was basically recruited by a group of institutional investors in 2013 to launch Armory Square Ventures. We were inspired by venture capitalists like Brad Feld at Founder Group, pursuing the thesis of backing great entrepreneurs in secondary markets. And I've been doing that ever since. It's been an incredible ride since we started in 2014.
I love it. And could you take us back even kind of pre-professional, just like early life, where you grew up, what the family, environment was like, what all the context around kind of who you were before you became a professional?
Absolutely. So I was born in Pittsburgh in the late 1970s. My parents are immigrants from India. My father is a professor of engineering, and both he and my mother, who was also an educator, inspired a lifelong love for education, for pursuing intellectual pursuits, and also introduced me to music. So I don't know if you know this about me, Wills or Andy, but my real passion when I was a child was I wanted to be a professional musician. I actually applied to engineering schools and conservatories. I got into a few conservatories. Thankfully, I decided to pursue a career in technology investing because I don't know if I'd be able to put food on the table as a professional violinist. But I really do think my musical background played a big role in some of the things I pursued later on in my career, because so much of early stage investing is evaluating teams and understanding the chemistry, what rapport between the various team members and how they work together as an ensemble. I guess you could use sports analogies that way too. So that's a little bit about kind of my background. As I think I grew up in Vermont in my middle school and high school years. I lived in a modest home by a lake, and I never in my wildest dreams thought that I would later in life return to that sort of environment to launch a venture fund. But I think being in nature and enjoying the outdoors, understanding being in a community that prides itself in lifting everyone else up and trying to figure out what works collaboratively for the entire community is something that draws me here. And that's one of the reasons why I made Upstate my home. So that's, a little bit about me. No one in my family, in my immediate family, pursued careers in business. So I still, although my parents, I believe, are proud that I do something that makes an impact, I think they're still, we're hoping that hoping to this day that I pursue a PhD and join their example in academia. But in general, that's a little bit about my background.
That's great. So, Mike, if I may, just one other question, kind of that early life, were there any key moments or lessons that you took away either from your parents or through music that really may have defined kind of who you became both personally and professionally? Like anything that stands out as a seared in the mind for you?
Yes. Oh, wow. Where to start? I think there are probably two experiences from my childhood that have made a huge impact on how I look at the world today. Starting with the musical example, I think one thing that I appreciated about the music world is it showed me that there was like no room for mediocrity. Like at the end of the day, when I was 16, I was fortunate enough to this is so many years ago, but I was accepted to be part of this thing called World Youth Symphony. We played with Zach Roman, but I saw that although I was good in my local high school in the state of Vermont, I realized that I was not, say, at the level of being a professional soloist in the world, and I realized that the market was telling me something about there's probably other things that I need to pursue in terms of talents, but I think that what it also helped do is it helped eviscerate an ego. I think my college years also did that for me. I would say when I went to MIT, I thought I was, a world-class math science student. I, grew up learning about engineering through my father and attending some of his classes. And then I came to MIT and I realized I was competing with people in the Eastern European Math Bolivia team who, were already finished with graduate math by the time they were freshmen. And I didn't have many AP classes in the school that I attended in Vermont. So again, I think one thing that was helpful about that experience, as well as my musical experiences, was that I knew I had intelligence. I could outwork a lot of people, but I knew that there were a lot of people a lot smarter than me. And I felt that by eviscerating my ego and having some level of humility, I think that's a very, very important trait to have, whether you're an entrepreneur or an investor.
I love that. No hope for mediocrity and eviscerating the ego.
So, Mac, if we could take a step back to something you said a minute ago about when Will's asked, anything that music contributed to your professional career, can you unpack just a little bit about what you learned as a musician? And a musician is typically, I'm imagining, playing with other musicians, and how you actually apply that, not the theory, but the application in your work as a venture capitalist dealing with teams.
Absolutely. I think one of the first things that music teaches you is the importance of reading nonverbal signals and really trusting your instincts and intuition. I think one of the things that we learn that as we go through education, K through 12 and post-secondary school and graduate studies for those who pursue graduate studies, I think these are all incredible experiences where we learn a lot of great analytical frameworks, which are important in investing. You do need to understand how to size markets, how to do competitive benchmarking of technologies and companies. But you also need to be able to read people, and you need to understand what's not being said when they're pitching you, and being able to read how is that person interfacing with his or her co-founders or direct reports or, other people who interface with that person in their life. And so I think that situational awareness is something you pick up in music, because so much of that is through nonverbal cues when you're putting together an ensemble. You could have an ensemble that you create with 4 musicians who are all each in their own individual right, great solo violinists or cellists or violists. But if there's the wrong chemistry and rapport and poor communication between those people, it can sound acrimonious. It can sound just not like a right ensemble. And I think there's many things I feel that we can apply in terms of similar concepts into the entrepreneurship world. It's more difficult to do via Zoom. You can get some of it over Zoom, but I think a lot more of that can happen in person as well. So I think that's one thing that's important in music. Another thing that I think is important in music is the importance of refining your pitch, right? So when you study, I studied classical music, and I was an aspiring solo violinist. But you can have many violinists try to play a similar passage of a Beethoven or a Mendelssohn violin concerto. They might get all of the notes right. It might be technically correct, but it may not make the right impression on the audience. And I think what happens is a great musician will see the different ways in which audiences will engage with his or her performance and figure out how to maybe add a bit more vibrato, change the dynamics, change the pacing, change the cadence. I think the same thing is true in entrepreneurship at VC. When you're raising funds, when you're raising capital, when you're pitching someone to join your team, you're always pitching. You're always finding ways to refine that story, that elevator pitch, into something that will ultimately resonate and sing. And there's a rhythm, there's a cadence that you find when you make that pitch that is ultimately important as you practice. That's something that I think is something very similar in the music world as it is in the entrepreneurship and VC world.
Great. That just back to the nonverbal signals, as we were kind of thinking about this interview, we like to come up with something that's maybe challenging, in your face right out of the gate with a question. And I think the nonverbal signals is a really good segue. If we were to kind of take the inverse of that, which is verbal signals, we're in a business that is very emotional. We're dealing with people's money. We're dealing with people's businesses. And these are businesses coming out of the womb that they oftentimes think of as their babies. You strike us as a person who's always very calm, chill, and I guess, and it doesn't kind of get rattled. And I guess one question on kind of the signals and reading people, two questions. How does that personality kind of help you, benefit you in your role? And are there ever times where you actually kind of get fiery, raise your voice, turn up the heat? Where it's clearly a verbal signal, it's not a nonverbal signal.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think you're being far too kind about when you say that I'm very relaxed about it. If you talk to my wife or make people work with me, you might get a different view. I definitely believe I have a pretty high energy and sometimes could be high strung. That probably being by the lake and doing yoga and running and biking probably helps me a little bit. And probably as you get older, you also learn that you never let the highs get too high or the lows get too low, right? But you do need to have passion and energy. I think that's something I bring to my work, and I love to see in entrepreneurs. I think that the question about how does that inform how I look at investing? I think that what I back to the point I made earlier about ego and humility. I think that what I really love about this business is that you're always learning, and you learn through your founders, and you learn as much more from your mistakes than you do from your successes, right? We all appreciate this, right? You guys have had a great track record too. We have a mutual investment in Bento Box. We have another company, ACD. There have been some companies that have just been rocket ships, but I think there's many other companies where there's been a struggle that hasn't been a straight line from 0 to 1. But I think that if you instead of letting those things bog you down and you say, well, hey, what did I learn from this? How would I take whatever happened in this business, say if it was a lost sale or a fundraise process that fell through, what would I do differently the next investment? And you take that as a learning experience. I think that's a very important thing. I think the other thing that's important for me in terms of applying a philosophy of I think the Stoic philosophers is someone that I spent a lot of time reading a lot of the books of the Stoic philosophers, and they focus a lot on making sure you focus on what you have control over and what you don't have control over. I think a lot of us, whether we're entrepreneurs or investors, focus on all the things that are going wrong in our lives instead of focusing on where we have control. And I think that helps in investing. But I'm sure like you, like I'm very, very invested in my entrepreneurs that I work with. And so when they're going through tough times, I'm also going through tough times. It's not easy.
Yeah. I mean, Andy and I think are always beating ourselves up about what did we miss? Well, how could we have helped more? That your point about like you feel what your founders feel resonates loudly. And I love that concept of like, don't focus on what's going wrong. Don't focus on what you have control over. I hadn't thought of it quite that way. Because I would have thought you go, oh, focus on what's going right, or rather like focus on where you have control is a really interesting concept.
So, Mac, one thing I am curious about, again, it's a variant of when Somak catches fire, whether it's verbally or non-verbally, relative to the people around him. So much of our job involves mentoring, coaching, advising, and often in situations where we don't have control. I mean, we do this via influence. We don't own typically majority stakes. How do you deal with it when we like to say our business is applying pattern recognition, where we've seen the movie 150 times, we have a good idea of what happens if you go left versus right. How do you handle it when your founders aren't taking the medicine or are not listening?
Yeah. Such a good question. And I will go back to the earlier statement of saying what focus on where you have control, where you don't have control. I think, there's been this is something we talk about a lot in our show, right? If you look at this past decade of the venture-backed startup world and entrepreneurship overall, I think a lot of founders were, saw that the founder reigns supreme. And at the end of the day, you try to find companies where you get the funds, where you can raise the best valuation, the best structure that gives them the most control. And I get all of that. That is important to think about as a founder. You do want to have the right partner. You don't want usurious terms. But I think when I look at the people who I've spoken to who are my mentors, who are some of the founders of the most well-known VC funds in our industry, I think the original purpose of a great venture investor was to be your Sherpa, your consigliere, the person that helps you navigate the peaks and troughs of entrepreneurship. And I think the challenge we face as investors is that not everyone wants that advice, right? So I think part of what I guess your question is like, how do you deal with that? What we try to do when we have a difference of opinion with founder rather, and are trying to encourage him or her to pursue another path, is introduce to as many other founders in our network, other portfolio company CEOs who've been in similar situations as that founder, and see if they can potentially give them different points of view about how they would navigate that situation. It's one thing if your board member, your investor is telling it to you, but if there's numerous other founders who are giving similar types of advice and have that operating experience that they can draw upon to help them navigate that situation, whether it's a pivoting to product, whether it's coming to a more capital efficient business model, whether it's a hire or a firing decision, I think it's easier when you bring other people who are fellow founders that they trust. But sometimes you do that and the founder still isn't prepared to make a change to his or her strategy. And then you have to think sometimes in those situations realize that it may have not been the best investment decision, frankly, right? Like it's hard to change human beings, right? And you have to also have to think about, this is one thing I feel I appreciate more and more now, having done this for a few decades. When you think about the type of individual who decides to launch his or her own business, they are by definition people who are highly opinionated, have very healthy self-esteem. All of us, you all have founded multiple businesses, right? You don't like working for other people. You don't want people telling you what to do. So it's a very specific type of personality that ultimately is found in people who are entrepreneurs. And that's not always the easiest person to tell, hey, you're wrong, do it this way. You're not doing this the right way. It's sometimes they need to kind of experience it themselves before they come to the same conclusion. So I don't have I have to say I've experienced what you're talking about multiple times. And in the instances where we've been able to find a way to work on strategies together to help the business grow and to modify strategies and to help influence the entrepreneur. Other entrepreneurs help. I think great independent board members, by the way, are also super, super valuable. I think way too many startup boards these days are populated by VCs who might have had some operating experience, but might have more kind of financial acumen and don't have the rich industry domain expertise of scaling the business from a few people to 50, 100, 200, 500 people through an IPO. So I found that the bringing people like that early on in the business is super, super helpful. It can help mediate some of the tension between the founder and investor.
You mentioned deals that we've actually worked on together. And part of the reason I think we were so excited about this interview is we were doing our own versions of the postmortems, and thinking back on the deals that we were involved in. And, I know we each had a role in working with those teams. One of them turned into a great success. One of them, we got our money back, which you'd also view as, in some cases a success. And in both of those instances, I think Andy and I would both agree that you played a heavy role in getting to the exit. Can you help us understand, maybe without naming names or being too specific, like how you realized that this was the time to kind of plant that seed or encourage the founder to get to that point? In one case, wound up, again, being a great exit. In another case, it could have easily become a zero, and it didn't. Like, what was going on, if you can go back to those moments to think about, like, hey, I think now is the time that we should start to think about figuring out how to, exit this business?
Sure. I mean, so I want to give credit where credit is due. I mean, at the end of the day, the founders are the ones who ultimately make the exits happen. We can be a sounding board, but they're the ones who really are able to to create those options and get them to the finish line. And it's funny, it's a very, very, I'm sure you appreciate this, not only from our mutual investments, but from other companies that you have invested and seen go through an exit process. It's a very, very complex decision and it's a harrowing decision, right? To go through an exit. You put your whole entire life into this company, right? It's your baby, you every waking moment. And so when you're thinking about selling the business, that it has to, it has to feel right? And that decision is often done with, through what the market is telling you. So to use one example, where a company that we worked on together, where it wasn't like a massive exit, but it was still a successful outcome for the founder, and we got our money back. I think when we were going through that process of thinking through options about a raise versus an exit, we saw that this business had a really compelling technology, a very talented founder who had strong domain expertise and great relationships within his industry sector. But we were not going to see nonlinear growth, which, today's environment, growth is important now. Unit economics, profitability, gross margin, burn multiples. The fact of the matter is, it might have been, frankly, easier for that company to raise money today than it when he was looking to raise money, say, a few years ago. But we knew from our experience talking to numerous other Series B, Series C investors that, that it would be very, very difficult to get a lead for that next round. And so we ultimately told the founder, and I know you all work with me too in helping to counsel this entrepreneur. Your insights here were also super helpful. That you could potentially try to go down the Series B route, but given how little money you've raised, there are other people who would love to consider your technology as something that could complete their product offering as a tuck-in acquisition. Why don't we get ahead of the process before you run out of cash and see if we can get a few strategic bidders and then ultimately get to the best outcome possible? This particular founder, as you may recall, wasn't particularly thrilled with that idea, given how he'd been spending many years building this business and had much higher aspirations. But he actually came to one of our events, actually, that we hosted Upstate maybe a few months ago. And he was like, I'm so grateful you pushed me to do that. Like, it ended up being one of the best decisions I ever took. And I'm really happy with the new place. We've got broader distribution. So that we're very happy that worked out the way it did. It doesn't always happen, right? In the case of the other business, which was a much, much larger outcome, I have to say, like, the credit goes to this founder, right? She was able to pivot the business. It was a business that was going to we thought would be very adversely impacted from the pandemic, and managed to pivot, create new product offerings that ultimately grew during the pandemic, and ultimately found an option that was a great new home for the business. I'm not saying this just to be like, modest or public. I have to tell you, like, I know that when we had some of our early board discussions years ago, we had talked about, would we consider selling the business for this price or that price? And she said, no, I think we have something that's much, much bigger than what any of us are imagining. And this is something where I have to say, I've also learned a lesson from this, right? Even as an investor who's been investing in B2B SaaS and marketplace businesses for many years, when you make a bet on a founder, you really, you have to trust his or her instincts too. And in this case, we listened to her, and I'm glad we did, right?
Okay.
We had opportunities to potentially sell much earlier.
If I could just, like, one thing that you said in there was what the market or how the market might respond to, this founder coming back for a Series B financing, what that would look like. And I think about our backgrounds, Andy and mine, having, never been in venture capital prior to launching our fund, more in kind of operating and mentoring roles. And I look at your background, and yes, there was operating in it, but then you worked at, large venture capital funds. Was it there that you gained this perspective on the importance of kind of macro environments, and the potential of these businesses? Because we've always thought about it as like ground up. And I think only in the last maybe 5 years have we started to really consider, well, what's going on, at a higher level. Like, where did that instinct come from in your kind of analysis of these businesses once you're invested in them, and what you do with them, I guess?
Right. Yeah. No. Well, I think that one of the adages that I learned when I started my venture career was at Edison Partners, and I think our managing partner said, great companies are bought, they're not sold, right? But I think that, the idea is that, if you create something that has enormous value, it'll be reflected in the obviously the financials of the business, the unit economics of the business, the retention. There's a whole bunch of metrics, obviously, we all look at as software investors, but that will tell you one part of the story, right? The other part of the story comes from just your interactions with many people in your network. So one of the most important things I did early in my career was I took a position before business school at a nonprofit association called the Software and Information Industry Association. I thought I would only do that for a few months. I ended up working there for a few years, including while I was in business school. And what I did was I spent a ton of time developing relationships with C-level executives at Google, at Microsoft, CIOs and CTOs of some of the largest companies in the media world, and in Wall Street and pharma, the heads of M&A at a lot of these organizations. And I just felt like, wow, I'm being paid to network and build these relationships. I have no profit motive, but I get to see how each of these different groups think. How does a CIO, but when I say CIO, I'm talking about a chief information officer, not a chief investment officer. But how does a CTO or a CIO of Goldman Sachs look at build versus buy decisions? What does it take for Microsoft to consider investing or acquiring a large asset, or the head of M&A at Google? And that being able to have those relationships and then using that to inform your own investment decisions are important, because what happens is you have a thesis, right? You'll have a hypothesis when you make the original investment. But as you all know, the technology changes so quickly. Look at all the things that are happening in AI and how quickly that's upending so many of our assumptions about how businesses could scale, right? So the reality, you might have had a hypothesis at the time of the Series A round, but then there could be a new technology launch that just renders that that technology obsolete, or Salesforce decides to launch a product that directly competes with you. So you have to, just like a poker game, you have to kind of like watch out. Like, you look at as you trigger over every card, how strong is your hand? If you still had a strong hand, double down, maximize your investment, continue to plow forward. But if you're seeing that the hand is getting weaker and weaker, you really do want to ultimately take advantage of an exit option while it's still available. So these are lessons that I learned initially through that nonprofit. I continue to, see this through, my time as an investor. And I think one of the things that is I probably learned as an investor that I wouldn't be able to identify anywhere else is you see how so many different entrepreneurs, how their actual storylines unfold. And unfortunately, more often than not, I think a lot of entrepreneurs and investors, frankly, held on to the idea that their technology was the best thing ever, that it was completely, it was worth a lot more than they had paid for it, right? And we're not willing to acknowledge that perhaps the market had commoditized and it would make sense to have an exit, sooner than later. So having seen that over and over again earlier in my career, I think that has made me think a lot more about it, as today I look at investments.
So Somak, I have to jump in here because there's a burning issue on the general topic of when to sell. You just a minute ago said something, and we believe, when you've got, company on fire, add more fuel. And particularly if, company's doing well and the market views the company as doing exceptionally well. And then as you know, there's a nice secondary market that's developing where investors, funds like ours, can unload ownership before a liquidity. So here's the question for you. We've just recently had a very painful experience. We were the first investor to company at a $5 million valuation. The last round before a refinancing a few months ago was at an $800 million valuation. This company had a dominant position, 80% market share, and was doing quite well. And we liquefied a little bit of our ownership in an earlier fund. But our view was, listen, we're in the venture business. There's risk here. We've got someone on fire that looks like they're heading towards unicorn status. Hold on. So we did. And then the financing environment did a full 180. The higher, grow environment changed a little bit. And all of a sudden, we were victims. Company was a victim of a very brutal refinancing. They did manage to raise $100 million in a tough environment. But Wolves and I are sitting here going, what's the old adage? I made my fortune by always selling too early. And again, we're in an environment in VC where there are a lot of folks who say, listen, I expect deaths and I'll be willing to deal with that. I'm just going to hang on and, try and hope for a unicorn or two in each fund. So what do you do when all the signals are looking positive? And you're also looking at a great return, a 40, 50, 60x return. But it looks like it's heading to the moon. What do you do? How do you decide when or if to sell?
Yeah, such a good question. By the way, this is something I feel like we made a bunch of great decisions here, but there are times where I think we would have definitely done things differently and taken even more at the table at times. But I think, such a good question you bring up. Like, I think as investors, we have to make lots of important decisions. Being on the buy side means you have to figure out the right price, the right structure, and when to buy. But you also have to know when to sell. And I know I had a wonderful discussion with Josh Kaufman, founder of First Round, who was giving me some advice as I was asking him for some, for some thoughts on some ideas where I thought I might want to consider exits earlier on. And I think he did note that, look, it's important to ride your winners. But when you start getting to a certain level of valuation, you have to think a little bit more about things like intrinsic value. So you mentioned the word unicorn a few times, right? I think there were a lot of unicorns minted over the last few years. But, when you think about the business, like, would you, at the price that they raised that last round, are you a buyer or a seller? Now, I know that you all, like me, focus on early stage investments. but you, I'm sure, have invested in follow-on rounds for other companies. And in those follow-on rounds, if your intuition and analysis says, no, I would mostly be a seller, I really wouldn't be a buyer, I think it's usually probably a good idea if you can to take some chips off the table, right? And we did that, for example, in ACV, which was our big win in Fund 1. The company went public in 2021. This is an automotive marketplace that connects buyers and sellers of used cars and dealerships. But, back in I might get the exact date wrong, but I think it was like 2019, 2020, like close to when the pandemic started. I knew that we were going to be able to raise rounds higher by price. I knew this company would be worth a lot of money, but I also knew that as an investor, it's important to take some chips off the table so you feel like you're playing with house money, right? So we basically, talked to numerous secondary buyers and we were able to get not just all of our invested capital back, but we also returned a good chunk of Fund 1, but we still held on to the vast majority of the investment. Mm-hmm. But at least we could say, at the very least, we got our money back, returned a large part of the fund, and now let's just hold and ride the upside. I think that that's a very, very important thing to do. I have also been guilty of sometimes holding things too long, and I think many people over the last 3 years in the VC industry, suddenly started drinking their own Kool-Aid and felt, look, the price is going to keep getting higher and higher and higher, and you're going to always regret not taking money at the table. But I think that, especially for seed funds, funds with finite life, I think I think it's important to explore liquidity sooner than later. But still, keep a nut that you could ride the upside, and that could just be gravy, right?
I love that concept of if you dispassionately approached these opportunities, even, because again, we know a lot about the companies. Would I be a seller or a buyer at this price? Just asking yourself that simple question, I think, is very powerful.
And your concept of intrinsic value, at what multiple is this round at? And, looking at that, does this make sense?
Absolutely. Over a broader time period, right? Multiples were obviously at historic highs a few years ago, but now they've obviously gone perhaps to another extreme where they're almost too conservative.
So on the one hand, I was just going to say, on the one hand, we want to see these report to our investors, this company is up, X times from when we invested. On the other hand, we go back to that key question of, does that make sense? We're glad, but
I would say, another thing that I think is important, and I try to, I think one real benefit of being a VC based in upstate New York is that I'm not surrounded by the echo chamber of all of the tech investors who are all just kind of wired a certain way. I think what I'd love to do when we're thinking about exit planning decisions is also talk to people who are in private equity investing in those industries, CEOs who've been operating in those businesses for many years, and get their sense on how we should look at exit planning. Like, would they be a buyer or seller in this market? Now, at the end of the day, PE looks at things a very different way. They look at things obviously based on cash flow. We look at things via growth. But by bringing in a variety of perspectives, you can potentially pierce some of the groupthink that I think we can all be victim of as early stage investors in the equity.
If we could park, because I know there's a big component to your strategy in the fund that's focused on, not being in the, maybe the echo chambers kind of markets for venture capital. If I could just park that for a sec, you mentioned a conversation in this case with Josh Kopelman. You referenced partners at Edison, who I think one of them told you companies are bought, not sold. Are there any other key mentors, individuals across your professional career that stand out, who gave you a piece of advice that you always now live by?
Oh, wow. Yes, absolutely. There's so many, but I'll try to focus on, a few that I know have played an outsized role in my career in VC. I feel like, when I was in business school, I took a class on value investing. And I know that I learned a lot about investing through my time in startups as well as working at these other funds. But, this whole concept of intrinsic value, margin of safety, investing in your circle of competence, these are very, very important tenets of value investing philosophy, which is something that I feel I look at, every day. I had a stats professor, his name was David Duran, who to this day is probably one of the greatest teachers I ever had when I was in school. And he introduced me to Nassim Taleb, and my favorite. He's written many books, obviously, over the years, but his original book, Fooled by Randomness, really was one of my favorite books about investing and risk management to this day. And so I think that I would say was one very, very big influence. On the professional side, in terms of other people who influenced me, clearly my other partners from Edison, John Martinson, other people who worked with me there, Michael Koppelman, who was Josh's brother, and then other people who I sat on boards with throughout the year. So I was fortunate early on in my career, initially as a board observer and later as a board director, to be on board with people who were among the early partners at NEA, at Sequoia, Excel, Bessemer, and I would watch how they looked at their businesses and their experiences that they brought through many decades of investing, how they led board meetings, how they got entrepreneurs to ultimately, agree to certain points of view and take their perspective to listen to the entrepreneurs. So I think there's so many people I've had the good fortune of working with. I think I would put those people as mentors, and then there's our CEOs as well. So George Shamoon is the CEO of ACV Auctions. I appreciate having had an opportunity to play some part of the story before they went public, but I've learned so much from him about how to manage my business and how to help other entrepreneurs. And when you try to get your feedback from your entrepreneurs, how can I be a better board member? How can I support my entrepreneurs more? When you're fortunate enough to work with a CEO who's willing to give you honest feedback about things like that, that helps you do your job a lot better. And that's something I'm incredibly grateful for.
I love, I think about that last comment, learning from our CEOs immediately jogged my memory. There's one of our teams produces hands down the best reporting we've ever seen from a company, and they do it in a way that they kill like 3 or 4 birds with one stone. It's their presentation deck, it's their quarterly board meeting, it's their investor update, and they virtually automated the way they do it. And I literally just stole the way they, I was like, this is great. Are there any key, you mentioned the business school professor, the partners at Edison, people on boards, the CEO at ACV. Is there one standout lesson or thing that you learned or thing that you stole from any of those that you said, I'm always going to apply this in how I operate? And I know there's many, but like one that jumps to mind.
Yeah, using the George Shamoon example, I think one thing that I feel George is a master of is, setting expectations, meeting those expectations and exceeding them, but specifically in managing expectations, right? I know he in the past might have been, some of the board members used to joke like, George, are you sandbagging here? You really do, you have probably a much stronger pipeline than you're suggesting, right? He's like, oh, I don't know. I may make this, but it's going to be a very difficult quarter, guys. Just prepare yourself for this. And sure enough, like clockwork, he get the numbers exactly. He exceeded them. And it's like, George, why are you doing this? But the reality was that we just, we even though we probably, could have pushed, at times says that we need that he was maybe putting a little bit of buffer in those numbers. It means such a world of difference as investors, right? And the same thing applies for us and our LPs, right? If we tell our LPs like, oh, we know for a fact that we're going to do X% sort of multiple of capital or this type of IR, I think a lot of early investors are in their careers to make those mistakes, and then the markets change, and then you suddenly it's a situation where you may still be doing very well compared to your peers, but because you set those expectations a certain way, you've lost your credibility, right? The other thing is just about like following through on what you said you would do. That's like the best way to ultimately cement your reputation, right? So I think when you tell an entrepreneur, I'm looking to make an introduction to you to this person, I hope to find this hire, we all get bogged down with so many different competing, conflicting responsibilities. But, any entrepreneur you ultimately offer to help, like you don't follow through, you lose your credibility, right? And your reputation is everything. So it's so interesting. What I find in this world is that if you're an investor who actually says who will do what they say they will do, that's something entrepreneurs remember, and that's why they'll continue to want to, raise money from you and bring you into other companies that they work with. That's something that I learned from my entrepreneurs, mainly because they were at times when I didn't follow through, they would call me out on it, right? It would be like, you said you'd do this, but you didn't do that, right? And that's like, I think I learned my lessons from some of those past experiences. Yeah.
We're smiling thinking about that's one of the things we preach while we're running the incubator. We called it the do to say ratio, and you usually want that to be 1-to-1.
Yeah, absolutely.
Easier said than done.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, Mike, for the benefit of our listeners, and I know we've been talking a bit about your work and your firm, can you tell everybody what Armory Square Ventures is?
Sure. So Armory Square Ventures is a early stage venture capital fund that invests in high growth B2B software businesses led by founders primarily in secondary markets. So we can technically invest anywhere in the United States or Canada, but we proactively focus on cities like Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, Columbus, Pittsburgh. I have a partner she's based in Indianapolis. So we believe that some of the best businesses in the world are created in Middle America. They have, incredible world-class universities. They have angel networks, incubators, accelerators, the low cost of living, the high quality of life. But they don't just normally have access to the venture markets. They don't have as many people who can lead their first Series A round and can be a conduit to talent and follow-on capital for these regions. And so we have been doing this now for over a decade. We take a concentrated approach to investing. So we do up to 15 companies in a fund versus, say, 30, 40 shots on goal. And that means we have to have fairly high conviction. We have to have enough conviction that we believe we could go to the ends of the earth for that entrepreneur and help them, recruit that talent and recruit that follow-on capital. And that's ultimately the model we play in. And, we are a returns-oriented investor. So that's at the end of the day, we're evaluated the same way as Sequoia, Kleiner, or TI Ventures, I'm sure would be evaluated. But we do also have, we have enormous pride about the impact that our companies play in those local geographies. If you create a company that goes public in a Buffalo, where you have a nice high 9-figure exit in Rochester or Indianapolis, you might, in a place like New York City, that's still an incredible accomplishment. But in a market like a Buffalo or a Rochester or Columbus or Indy, you play a huge role in injecting optimism in that region and inspiring more and more entrepreneurs to build businesses in places that were left for dead, many decades ago, and inspire many, many people to come to those regions as well. And that's something that we're really excited about. That's why I get out of that every day. It's just creating that impact.
And so, Mike, if we can push on you a little bit there, it's great that you're helping these cities and making big impact. But if I'm an LP, tell me why it is that this is a good strategy.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. At the end of the day, as I said, we're a returns-oriented fund. But what's important, way back to this concept, the concepts I learned in value investing is, some of the greatest value investors, Albert Ryan made money by investing in inefficient markets that are poorly understood, that are opaque, that are not easily accessible, right? Our companies that we invest in are not generally companies that are profiled on Crunchbase. In a place like New York City, which is an amazing, amazing market. I love investing in New York City, and I consider New York City a second home. When I started my career in venture capital in New York City in the 2000s, there were 5 of us. If you tried to do a venture capital event or a networking event, you would probably have 5 of us. So, Fred Wilson was in the process of starting Greenhill Square Ventures. Josh Kaufman was really still doing more angel investing. Now you have hundreds of these seats, right? But there was this golden era, like within that time period investing, especially in the mid 2000s, where if you were one of those early investors, you could see incredible returns. I think that's the same thing is true in our markets, right? Have you ever read the book that's called, it's a book called VC of History, which talks about the analogy between whaling and the venture industry, right? The concept of carried interest, this author claims, comes from the whaling industry. When you brought a whale on a ship, you did a 20% share was carrying the whale. But the thing is that what happened was all the whalers who saw that people were successful in a certain area of the Pacific would then inspire all the other whalers to go to that same part of the ocean, and then it was overfished and there were no more whales, right? I think the same thing is true in venture capital, right? You can find great entrepreneurs in New York City, NASDAQ, and some of those entrepreneurs will be the most important returners of the venture capital industry overall, period, right? But there's so many other areas that are being overlooked, and if you can find those interesting companies and lead those rounds and take that risk early on, you can generate massive outsized returns and create alpha. And I think that that's why I think LPs get excited about our strategy.
I love that idea of overfished markets.
And I hear in that through Andy's question, yes, there's a strong thesis around generating, returns through value investing in these markets. In addition to, hey, it feels great to have a big win in a market like Buffalo. Is there anything else intrinsic to the work that we do that really just gets you out of bed, gives you that yes feeling? Andy and I were talking about it recently, and when you really start to think about it, it's like, what is it? Why do we do this work? Why are we so obsessed with it?
Yeah. So I'd love to hear your views. For me, it's about the optimism that I see all around me. The world is sometimes, when you read the news, can seem like such a dark place, right? It's not just the stuff happening in the economy. There's wars, there's polarization. There's a lot of things that are challenging about these times. But when you get to surround yourself with entrepreneurs who are trying to completely change, how the world operates or thinks about a certain type of industry, that's just so inspiring. And I think, when I look at criteria to invest in companies, I've mentioned this in other interviews before, we look at a lot of the traditional analytical frameworks that any early stage investor looks at, like TAM, total addressable market, unit economics, scalability, go-to-market. All those things are very important. Is it a must-have versus nice-to-have, as I've talked to people in our network? But the single most important reason why me back in entrepreneur, to your question about why I get out of bed, is that I want to quit my job and work for that CEO full time. I can't stop thinking about his or her own business. I'm bringing me up in dinners with my wife, with my family members. I just can't stop thinking about it. And it ultimately gives me energy versus draining energy. If the entrepreneur is calling me at 10 p.m. on a Saturday, I'm excited about ripping on new ideas versus why the hell are you calling me a late Saturday night? You're draining my energy. Those type of things is what makes this job so incredibly exciting and such a privilege. What type of job allows you to, ideate on these new ideas and businesses and bring new people with companies that are creating GDP, that are totally transforming industries, and in our case, in many cases, transforming the communities that they live in. I think it's a very, very privileged job.
Yeah. I think we feel the same way. One of the things I think that we enjoy in particular is, and this is the case through a lot of our businesses, and I suspect a lot of yours, getting rid of the work that people hate doing, but is part of their job, and solving that with software so that they can spend their time on kind of higher order uses of their skill and talent.
Absolutely.
And betting on the underdog, right? That's
well, yeah. And that was I hear a lot of underdog kind of story in what you're sharing. And I know we talked about early life at the beginning. Is there any reason why you just want, what is it about the underdog that you love?
Yeah, I mean, I think really what I love about the underdog is just that, it's just, I feel maybe part of this is maybe I feel like I'm in maybe a counseling session, probably a little bit more than I should, but I feel like so much of my child experiences involve people who, thought I would never amount to anything, had written me off, right? And I felt that always was, that put the fire in my belly, right? That's just something like, no, I will show them that I'll amount to something, And when you see this in other founders, I just find that so inspiring, right? Like you can tell when you see certain types of entrepreneurs that they'll go through walls because they just know in their heart that they want to solve this problem, and they won't let anything get in their way of doing that. And they're just dismissed by everyone, right? And I think that's there's something that's really very inspiring about that, right? And so it's cool. It's really exciting. We say this to our LPs, right? When you look at some of these companies that we've had, and in our case, we have at least one mutual investment of a really exciting investment outcome. All the people who come in later rounds are very important players, and we're very grateful for the work they did. But to be able to say that you were able to take a bet on that founder before it was incredibly obvious is something that's so important. It's the same way I think about when you probably raised TIA, you probably feel this way about your early investors, right? I will always appreciate that we have institutional investors now, endowments, pension funds, but some of those early family offices or entrepreneurs who took a bet when I didn't have a leg to stand on, I was like, that was a very risky thing to do, right? And I'm going to always think about that person for the rest of my career, right? I believe we have a similar, hopefully, type of relationship with those founders where we took the bets when it wasn't as obvious, and that's very gratifying.
Your point about would I want to quit my job to work for this CEO, I love. Anything else that's non-obvious, the stuff that there's kind of the obvious frameworks that you look through, lenses that you look through when evaluating opportunities. Anything else, to the extent you can share it, that you always consider when making investments that our listeners might be surprised to hear?
Yes. I think that, we have a set of values that we actually publish this on our website that are important for, not just our team members in terms of the philosophy of ACE, but also for the entrepreneurs that we back. When we talk about things like curiosity, humility, persistence, grit, right? I think that it's really important, as a venture investor, to really make sure you understand the underlying motivations of the entrepreneur you're backing. So, that is one of the lessons I learned. I think it was from a partner at Tribeca, but I think other board members share this with me too, is that Somak, venture capital is a people business. If you're able to really understand what's driving that entrepreneur, you will be enormously successful, right? And that's difficult to do. With the ways that we try to do this at ASV is we try to spend time understanding that life history, what's motivating the founder. We talk to their people who are contemporaneous with them at prior roles. We talk to other direct reports, other advisors. But that part is really, really important. And then especially trying to figure out how do they respond in a high pressure environment? In the last few years, really before the market went through a bit of a correction, many investments, even in regions like Upstate, were happening at a rapid pace that didn't allow you a chance to really subject the entrepreneurs to proper diligence. And, what we find is that there's certain entrepreneurs who say they're interested in partnering with us, and then we'll give them a set of things that they would like them to complete in terms of their analysis of some of these questions that we answer. And so many people will be like, I don't have time for this. Sorry. And sometimes we regret not doing it, but in general, if they're not willing to do this type of stuff pre-investment, what's it going to be like post-investment when we're going to start working together as board members? So I think that these are some of the things that I would say are incredibly important for our style of investing, because we like to lead rounds. We take a concentrated approach. If we were doing 50, 60 investments and we just had to spawn a bunch of cap tables, that'd be one thing. But our approach only works if there is a harmonious relationship and where we have mutual understanding of how we work together, which is that's the type of things we do pre-investment. But the understanding the underlying motivation is so important. Really, we had some false positives in my career, right? We had times where we thought the entrepreneur was focusing on building $1 billion business. What's the phrase? I think it was Noah Wasserman who said, do you want to be rich or do you want to be a king? Right? I think for the last 10 years, most entrepreneurs want to be rich and be king or queen, right? And we prefer entrepreneurs who think that shareholders, maybe they will be the CEO up through the exit. Almost all of our investments have had the CEO be the founder up through to the exit. But sometimes you need a different type of person to maybe fill gaps around the team those are things that we like to suss out well before we invest.
I love the understanding the underlying motivations. I go back to what you said earlier, that the child who was written off and had to prove to the world that he could amount to something.
It's and I'm sure you see some of your portfolio too, right? I think Josh, you open Lux would invest, right? Chips and shoulders, put chips in pockets. I think that's very, very true in the startup world.
Yeah, you also said something Andy often talks about. If this is what they're like on the first date, you can only imagine what the relationship is actually going to be like. Back to the ones that didn't necessarily want to do the hard work that you were asking them to do, because, hey, this is what a marriage actually is about.
Yeah, no doubt. I know you're interviewing me, but I see your question. How about you? What most of you guys have now been doing? I've been so excited to see how TI has evolved over the last few years. Like, what gets you guys excited about your job? Like, how now that you're several years into venture, when did TIA start? Was it
2014?
Okay, so it's actually been
similar time.
Oh my God, it's already been almost that. You were very close to when we started.
Yeah.
What gets you guys most excited about?
Well, yeah, I'm smiling because you described a situation where you said, you go to bed thinking about this business. You wake up in the morning as an investor, you're talking to your wife about it. We're about to hopefully close a deal on our eighth investment in our third fund. And it's exactly what you described. A guy who we love, he's passionate. He's up at 3 a.m. thinking about how to apply ChatGPT to his platform. Wills and I, every time we meet him, talk about him, we're going, damn, if we could wave a wand and make all of our founders kind of like this. That's exciting. And the other thing is that you talked about, we have a sort of a portal into the future. And granted, some of these futures don't materialize, but being able to work with smart, motivated, visionary, driven folks who are really reinventing the future. And you touched on another thing that gets us jacked up, and that's, going into industries that are pre-digital, that haven't evolved in 50 years.
Yeah.
And knowing that if this business is successful, it's going to, transform the horse and buggy into a car. So that's pretty exciting and motivating. And that leads me to a question for you. So, what's the hardest part of this business for you?
The hardest part,
it's not all fun, right?
No, it's not. The hardest part of this business, I think, is even though I said that I look at failures as a way of learning lessons, it's so hard not to get very personally involved with what you're seeing happen with your founders. Like, it's like if you're having children, you're not children, like they're obviously peers, or my saying me, sometimes they're older than me, but I consider them like close family members at times. And to watch some people go through certain hardships and challenges, and sometimes it's not all related to anything that they chose, it's just what's happening in the industry, is really, really difficult. I think another part that's difficult is just watching, getting rejections is like par for the course, whether you're a VC raising a fund, whether you're an entrepreneur selling a new product or raising a round. But, I there's part of me that just, I see when you see the founders you back and see how unique their businesses and how special they are, you want to find people who are the right fit. But I think, what I'm seeing in this current environment is that people have gone to a whole other extreme in terms of just being completely risk off. And they're missing out on some amazing opportunities. Maybe they're triaging the portfolio companies, are too preoccupied. But I think it's hard not as both the stuff as a founder, but even as an investor, to say, wait, what's going on? This is such an incredible opportunity. Thankfully, our companies are, for the most part, pretty well capitalized, and we've got plenty of dry powder and reserves. But it's even after doing this for many, many years, it's difficult to not take that a little bit personally at times, but you kind of have to brush that off. That's just part of being an entrepreneur or investor.
Somak, an hour has flown by, and you've been incredibly generous with your time and wisdom. We'd like to also keep our listeners hungry, because I think we could talk for at least another hour. 2 questions to wrap things up. and you've mentioned people, all these people that have had big impacts on you along the way. Other than family, is there a person in particular that you'd like to say thank you to, and why?
Oh yeah. Using outside of family.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, I've had this person speak at some of my annual meeting a few years ago, but my college roommate was a founder of Khan Academy, and I'm incredibly proud of obviously what he's achieved in the area of online education. But I also just appreciate how he's been there for me when from when I was a roommate to where I am today, and whenever I've had any issue in life, personal, professional, he's always made time for me, and that means a lot. That means a lot to have to know people. Or Vikas, there's another person who is a COO now at ACD and a venture advisor. So a very, very close college friend who's been with me with some of my toughest times in my life. And is always just a phone call away to help me any sort of situation or decision. I just think like when we talk about, we might have a lot of acquaintances in the business world, but they're the very few people we get to count on as friends. And with that, I'm grateful for all the money that, our funds have created for our LPs, for ourselves. But I think there's nothing better in life than to have deep, close friendships with people that you've known for many years. And that's something I'm just unbelievably grateful for.
That's great.
But final question. We've all been around enough to know that you can work really hard, but that serendipity often plays a huge role in our success or failures. Can you highlight one totally serendipitous person and maybe one serendipitous event that kind of came in and made a big difference for you positively?
Yes, absolutely. This would be the person who helped me launch ASMB over a decade ago. I have a venture attorney I work with named Ed Reitler, who I think we were catching up at one of his a venture event, back in 2013. And he told me that there were a group of investors in upstate New York who wanted to create a fund. And I had become a partner at that point in Tribeca. I was making good money, and New York City tech was exploding. I said, Ed, why would I go to Syracuse, New York and meet with these investors? That makes no sense. And it's just thinking is that like the serendipity of not only the fact that he had told me about this opportunity, but the fact that after I actually flew out to Syracuse and met some of those early people, I think, I'm so grateful I did. He had to ask me about 4 or 5 times. I said no the first 4 times. I think the 5th time I said, fine, I'll do you a favor. I'll fly out to Syracuse. I'll meet those people. And then I met some of those early backers, like the president of SCU, Eric Allen, whose family founded Welch Allen, and to this day are some of our most important investors and business partners. And I was like, that would have never happened were it not for the opportunity to actually make the trip and actually take the fund and getting past my inertia. So I think that's true about deal flow as well. Like you can't just rest on your laurels. You have to go out there. You have to meet new people and take chances. And that's something I try to instill even to this day.
Great.
That's what led you to create Armory Square?
That's absolutely what led to Armory Square. I flew here, and then I'd stayed overnight at a show we did here in this town, and it's like, really, the people I've met are amazing. I could do this world job by the lake. I didn't think I'd never have an office by the lake, but that's how it all started. It was a serendipitous introduction, and the serendipitous meeting with these early investors. I was like, I engaged just like within seconds of meeting those people. I want to be in business with these people for decades. Like I had never felt that way before. And that was still very special.
Wow. That certainly qualifies as a positive serendipitous event. But he only had to ask you 5 times.
Yes, that's exactly right. I'm great. Next time I'll go on the first trip.
Well, Somak, I've been taking copious notes here. We just so much learning, wisdom. Really appreciate you carving out time to do this and for all that you shared. Thank you.
It was a delight. Really enjoyed our discussion. Looking forward to doing more investments with all of you. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this interview. If so, please visit our website where you can find many more like it. It's important to remember that behind all the great products and companies and software that we love, at the end of the day, there are people.